afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to the World Economic Forum for hosting this important discussion. I'd especially like to thank Louise, Giannis, and Madeline for making sure this panel could happen. I'm Katie Kingsbury. I oversee the opinion section at the New York Times. In my role, I work with the columnists, editorial board, columnists like Tom Friedman, Maureen Dowd, Bret Stephens that you read in our pages every day, the editorial board, as well as the outside experts and thinkers that the Times publishes, many of whom are here at this meeting today. In the next 45 minutes, you will hear from these impressive panelists. You can tell how much they respect you as an audience because they've all changed their shoes. Well, maybe not Richard.
One pair.
Yeah. They're going to provide us all some context and experience that speak to the issues confronting us as we try to build trust as a key pillar in multi-stakeholder cooperation across government, businesses, and civil society. But first, a few introductions. I'm going to read them because I want to make sure I get them right. Richard Edelman is the CEO of Edelman, a global communications firm responsible for the annual Edelman Trust Barometer. In its 22nd year, the report covers a range of timely and important societal indicators of trust amongst businesses, media, government, and NGOs, shaping conversation and setting the agenda for the year ahead. Angela Williams, President and CEO of United Way Worldwide. United Way Worldwide is a network of nearly 2,000 nonprofit organizations raising funds from its community that are distributed through a bottom-up approach. Salah, tell me. Salah, thank you. Right. Is a Senior Vice President for Social Impact at Mastercard, an expert in financial inclusion and the use of technology for social impact. She currently leads Mastercard's $500 million pledge to close the racial and wealth and opportunity gap. Helena is Director General of Consumers International. Her organization represents consumer advocacy groups in various countries to ensure everyone has access to safe, sustainable products and services, ensuring customers are treated fairly and that businesses are trusted. Thank you all for being with us today. I'd like to start with you, Richard. If you can provide us with a little bit of context for this conversation, sure. What are the latest trends that you're seeing in terms of trust?
Okay, so to set a stage, we've done this 23 years. We do it in 28 countries, 32,000 people. We did the survey in November, so that's the data. Now, long-term trends. One, NGOs for years were the most trusted institution, well ahead of business, media, and government. That changed in 2020 when it became government at the height of the pandemic. Since then, it's been business. That's fact one. Fact two, the growing mass class divide in opinion. It started in 2012 in the US, in France, and in the UK. It's now metastasized. I'll give you data on that. But it's now, in 3/4 of the countries, more than 10% difference between the attitudes of the top 25% and the bottom 25%. The third is the battle for truth. Which you do every day, but the reality is that people feel as if they don't have enough information that's quality to make good decisions. And that's really become problematic since 2016, since the US election, since Brexit, but then we're now at a sort of different level of this with disinformation because of the pandemic. And I think the sort of last point is that trust has gone local. Historically, as a Jew, I always say this, it's the Moses model, top down. Some people say it's the Jesus model. However you want to do it, it's fine, top down. Then it went horizontal about 10 or 15 years ago with the rise of Facebook, went to peers, friends. Now trust is local in my employer and in my company and my CEO. My company's newsletter is the most trusted source of information, even ahead of mainstream media, crazy as that is. Okay, so 3 or 4 trends from this year that are important. The first is we absolutely observe an imbalance between institutions. Between government and business, there is now a 50-point delta on competence, 30 points on ethics. Business is the only institution seen as both trusted because it's competent and because it's ethical. It gets things done. NGOs have moved from being in that top right corner, both competent and ethical, to being ethical but not competent. I have more about this for you later, but that's a very sad fact for my colleagues. I'm sorry, I just tell you the data. You can hit me later. But I'm running fast. The second big finding is that we see a real dependence on business to be the savior. The question is how much business should be doing relative to other institutions. And that's really subject to, the third is the mass class divide. In 3/4 of the countries, we now see a 10-point delta. Not a single democracy do we see this in a good place. And that's partly because of this final statistic, then we can get on to the panel, the loss of economic optimism. Trust is totally tied to performance of the economy and to the projection of what the economy will be doing in the next 5 years. Not a single democracy has over 35%. That is the US, Japan, France, Germany, all down 10, 12%. My family will be better off in 5 years, classic polling question. So look, trust depends on the ability of institutions to deliver, and at the highest end in terms of countries are India and Saudi and UAE, and we also have China. And so what you see in this is more autocracy than democracy. You see also more in developing than in developed, and those are the two factors, but it's mostly tied to economic development, also that you have institutions performing equally in terms of trust. When you have a huge imbalance, then you have distrust, particularly low trust in government. And then last is the sense of inequality. If you have a deep sort of, I can't get there, you lose trust.
All right. So
there we go. And that very happy set of stats.
So let's talk a little bit about how to fix some of these trends.
Exactly.
Angela, at the United Way, you've built on-the-ground connections with the communities that you're working with.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how you've done that, but also what you're hearing from those communities in terms of where their lack of trust is coming from?
So, as Richard said, everything I think now, no matter what country you're in, is the hyper-local focus, and that's what United Way. That's how we as a network operate. And what we say is that our staff members, my colleagues, are the neighbors and the trusted advisors on the ground. And that's also hitting to what Richard is saying, this gap in terms of distrust, absolutely. It comes from, I think, not only when we're talking about the economic gap, but who has a seat at the table and whose voice is excluded. One of the things that I have seen with our network is that, especially when there's a time like this of high inflation and needs not being met, we are the ones that receive the phone calls. So when you talk about trust in action, it's when people pick up the phone. In the United States, they'll dial 211. And our call center operators say, how can we help you? And our call center operators also listen to what else is going on with that person. But it is a system where we take 21 million calls a year, and we can tell you on a daily basis of issues that are bubbling in communities that have not yet come out, but it's a way of being a bellwether or a canary in the mine shaft to begin to really understand what are people sensing and feeling. And then the last thing I'm going to say too, and Richard knows this with his corporate clients, but one of the things that what I think corporations don't think about as much as they should is the fact that their employees live in these communities.
Yep.
And the businesses must connect with the community and invest in the community and invest in their people, because that makes for a better employee, and that also makes for a better bottom line for any company.
Salah, you lead an effort at Mastercard to build trust. What role does the private sector, what responsibility does it have here?
It's a good question. First, thank you for having me here. I think this is an important conversation. And if I think about like the river that runs through these conversations, whether it's the Great Reset or you think that we have reset, is trust. The importance of trust and kind of the dissolving of it. In the private sector, I think we, according to the statistics and the data, I think there is a role to play. And at Mastercard, I think we think about it maybe 4 different ways. So first, I do run our racial equity work. I help run it with a team of people across the company. I also sit in the Center for Inclusive Growth, which is our philanthropic corporate hub, where I run our North America social impact portfolio. But if you look at either one of those, I think 4 things to me come to mind. One is in trust through inclusion, through technology, and then networks and partnerships. So if we start with inclusion, Mastercard has been doing inclusion for quite a while. We made a pledge, I think it was 2015, with the World Bank to include 500 million. We've passed that. And so we're aiming to include 1 billion in the economy by 2025. And we always think about inclusion as a way to foster trust. As we heard, if you can believe that your participation in the system actually leads to prosperity, you start to trust that more and more. And I think that links well to our racial equity work, where if you don't have access and you don't have equity, you are more mistrusting. So in 2020, we made a pledge of 500 million to help close the racial wealth and opportunity gap. And in that work, proximity to the problem and understanding experiential lived knowledge is so important, which takes me to partnerships. I think actually living and working and breathing with partners like my grantees in the center, they know the problems, they understand it. Having a human-centered or client-centered design, I think is the way to go in terms of not only building products that people know meet real needs, but services that are built on listening to what they really need and want. And then I think technology is an interesting one. We're a technology company, even though we've been doggedly focused on social impact and financial inclusion for a long time. And our CEO just wrote something, I think that helped sum it up, in 3 ways that we can look at technology for trust. And the first one is just basic data principles in privacy and governance. And GDPR, mainly in Europe, is a good place to look for that. And it simply says you should own your data and it should benefit you. And let's start there, right? Because there's all these stories of data breaches, et cetera. And so just having that basic knowledge and safety so you can connect into a digital system is important. I think the second one is bias in AI. And again, if we don't have access, and if AI is governing things from the color of your hands, if the water will turn on, all the way to healthcare, that's something to look at, right? And so we have a partnership with Howard University where we set up a Center for Applied Data Science and Analytics when we're looking at getting bias out of AI in healthcare and financial services. And the last one I'll mention is a safer crypto ecosystem. We have all these emerging technologies, whether it's the metaverse of crypto, and I think just using some of the principles of the formal financial system to really shore that up will help. And the last thing I'll mention quickly, I think that connects it all, is networks.
Yes.
So in the center, we have a theory of a network, Shamina Singh, and a lot of you know Shamina, really has driven home this idea that your propensity to succeed is dictated by your proximity to networks, whether virtual networks, financial networks.
That's so important.
And so giving people, again, access and opportunity to those networks. So you can be in community with people who understand your issues, but you expand the reach. So that was a lot of words, but I think everything we think about in terms of how the private sector really plays a role in social impact, financial inclusion, we're very doggedly focused on trust and what we can do well and authentically. So it's just a little bit about how we think about it.
Okay. Helena, you work directly with consumers and advocate on their behalf. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you've seen?
Sure, yeah, and I should give precedence to our members. The network is made up of NGOs in 100 different countries, most of which are low and middle income countries, and they're fantastic organizations that are listening to complaints, advising consumers, trying to sort of help them through this extremely difficult time, being watchdogs, making recommendations, you name it, anything we can do. And yeah, it's a really sort of restricting space. You talked about the sort of economic pain people are in, and right now it's at least good to see that as the #1 issue in the WEF's Global Risk Report, likely to be with us for the next 2 years. And we've seen that in terms of cost of living. This is, the consumer is embattled. The cost of living is the body blow. On food, our members, all of them, have highlighted very significant increases in food prices. In 20% of those cases, this was over 100% on fuel, and we know that in 90 countries there have been protests because of this. You're seeing, again, incredible price increases.
That goes to some of the economic questions.
Exactly. And the problem is that the access to debt and the likelihood that people then go into a downward spiral because of this is one of the big problems. We know that 71 million people have gone into poverty. This is, there is a downward approach that we are going to have to deal with. But beyond that, there are the sort of the 1,000 cuts that people experience in the marketplace. Beyond that cost of living. These are things like scams. Over the past 2 years during the pandemic, if you have been exposed to a scam, you are in the absolute majority. I think it's something like 46% of people usually can fall for that, and most people don't bother sort of reporting it because they don't know who to report it to or what will happen. The risks of being part of the digital economy are growing faster than access to the digital economy now. If you look at there's a great World Bank CGAP report on this. And then just things like product safety. If I want to buy from overseas, knowing that that product is going to be safe and then getting redress if I find that it's not what I want. These are basics that sort of become the flow that we have to live in as consumers. And then, if you try to look ahead, the rug gets pulled out from under you. If you are one of the 64% of people who now think that climate is an emergency, try going out there and dealing with the 456 different standards and labels to make the choices. Try to find somewhere where it's recyclable in practice. If you go online, read the 250 hours of terms and conditions, try to make sure that your data doesn't disappear somewhere, and make sure that you're not then charged more. I mean, there are digital rights experts who will speak beautifully to the rights aspect of this. We see a commercial issue with examples where for exactly the same service, not because that product is more scarce, you can be charged 5 times as much. Now, I'll get to the better part. One of the things we're seeing is that, the answer tends to be, well, we're just going to inform people more. We'll make sure that they're aware of the problems and we'll help upskill them. So that's good, but it's a bit like sending people into the fight and saying, we're just going to make you a better fighter. It's going to be okay. However competent and reliable you are, if you're on your own, we're going to teach you a bit more, but you're on your own, that is where you lose trust entirely, I would argue. And so this is why, can we look at approaches that then build? This is why collaboration is important, because when you look at the solutions to some of these things, like better harmonized standards for sustainability, for products, better harmonized standards for labels, better data policy and governance between countries through whatever process, G7, data free flow of trust, whatever you want. That takes deep collaboration. It takes collaboration not as a fluffy, nice to have aspect, but with strategic intent, and then with the representation of people. Because the opportunity we could lose here, I don't know whether I'm sure you've perused the very fantastic but quite long IPCC report. 40% to 70% of the opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will come through demand-side strategies. That's consumers making different choices. So if we don't collaborate and if we don't bring people in, we are not just losing trust. We are losing our marketplace. We are losing our planet, and we're losing our life on this planet.
We're going to turn to audience questions in just a minute. I'm struck, however, in listening to you all, the role of information and access to information, but also being heard, plays in the work that you're doing. That's obviously something in journalism that we have been as Richard points out, in journalism, we struggle with an issue of a lack of trust, a lack of trust, particularly in expertise. One of the ways we deal with that at the Times is we have very baked into our mission and opinion, but across the Times, independence, and of course, factual accuracy. Maybe we could talk for just a minute about how transparency and accuracy play into your work, and maybe we'll keep that conversation brief so that we make sure we have time for questions.
I'll just give one brief example that's just so relevant to us now around vaccine equity. And in the United States, especially where Black and brown communities did not trust vaccines. And what it took was partnership not only with pharmaceuticals, but healthcare systems to come to us, who are the nonprofits, who are in community, who are the neighbors, to explain the efficacies of the vaccine, how important it was, that it's no longer the Tuskegee experiments, and you can trust and to educate. And so I see in so many of these pressing issues that are facing communities today that you do need someone who is in community, who can have a kitchen-style seat at the table and have a conversation to be able to not only create solutions, but to make sure people have a fair chance.
So can I piggyback this?
Yeah, please.
So to me, one of the sadnesses of the last 5 years is the deterioration of trust in NGOs. And my hypothesis on this is that right-wing groups have done a really good job of disenfranchising NGOs. They've challenged the funding sources. They've associated you with Bill Gates and George Soros. They've said that you're big world people, as opposed to actually what you are, which is local. I mean, I just wrote down pandemic, climate crisis, racial equity. My God, the sweet spot of the civil society should be right now. But what's happened is splintering of groups, disappearance of the leaders, and also, frankly, advocacy towards the extremes. And that enables you to be pinned by the right. And also, you guys are great at punching, but terrible at taking a punch. And you have to learn to do two things. One is preempt. When they're going to punch you, you got to know they're going to punch you and say, why are they punching us? And sort of, we call it pre-bunking. It's my new word. It's debunking, which is pre-bunking. And the other is, when they hit you and they're inaccurate, hit back. Yep. Don't take it. Because if it's taken, then you're put into a box of, oh, well, of course that might be so. But the real world today is, you know, a little bit
How do you judge when to do that? I'm curious, because there's common belief that you may actually be giving something oxygen that's not real.
I've heard this a lot,
Yeah.
and since of what I do, and a lot of clients, well, leave that be. And if it's a definite inaccuracy, you must correct the record. You don't have to go DEFCON 3, but you must say, this is not so, and then have 3 other people say, this isn't so, not just you.
Yeah. I want to take some questions from the audience. Jonathan? Hold on one second, there's a mic.
My name's Jonathan Greenblatt. I'm the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. So I have a question for Richard and maybe for others on the panel. So when you talk about business being the most trusted sort of entity or sector, and then just a moment ago you talked about sort of the right wing disenfranchising NGOs, it seems like we're seeing a trend in the US of now the right wing going after big business in particular, like ESG is the new CRT, if you will, and has become, I've heard people here at Davos tell me they're no longer, Fortune 50 people, they're no longer using the phrase ESG because it's too poison, too toxic. So Richard, looking at these trends, do you think that big business will get knocked off as well? And that seems very complex in an environment where we're thinking in multi-stakeholder frameworks with business at the center.
So my response, Jonathan, is business needs to stand its ground. More than 2/3 of employees say that they want to work for companies whose values are equivalent to their own. 2/3 of consumers are belief-driven buyers. 80+% of people in institutional shareholding want to be with companies that are endorsing ESG. The one thing you have to do, though, is have one standard for ESG, not 180. You get picked off if you have too many different standards, and it's something that they can demagogue as opposed to own. Also, business has to be very clear about this is good business, not, you know, some kind of woke delusion. You know, that we're in business to make money. but it also is going to serve society. And focus your attention on 4 issues: sustainability, on jobs and reskilling, focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and geopolitics, like get out of Russia. But don't take on every issue. On abortion, because I know this is important, you absolutely have to provide medical care for your employees and talk to your employees. It doesn't mean you have to be a big public advocate on that unless you choose to.
Does anyone else want to weigh in? Question?
Maybe I'll just add, because it's on my company here, is that we've heard that too. And I think at Mastercard we have, well, I know at Mastercard we have a commitment to ESG. I think whether you can argue the principles and the measurement, the way we think about it is people, prosperity, and planet.
Yep.
And those 3 things are increasingly intertwined. The solutions are intertwined and not going away, and really germane to our business. So I think that we stand by that, and we're hearing the dialogue and seeing how it plays out. But I think if you can have kind of a simple definition, but that has import on your business, I think that helps kind of with the sustainability of it.
Hold on one second. Let's grab the mic. Thank you.
So my question is for Madame Salah Goss. I wanted to get more perspectives from the Global South, especially in terms of the grantees that you work with, because it seems to me that countries in the Global South face a peculiar crisis of trust in the sense that, yes, like normally we do not and cannot trust our governments, but now even the very foundations that we could trust, such as our own communities, because of disinformation, because of everything that makes us question even our own decisions, we cannot trust the very source that gave us, pride and strength of courage. And in your experience, is there like any peculiar challenges that you found from your grantees who are working in this area?
That's a great and hard question. Actually, before I was at the center covering North America, I lived in Kenya, and I did a lot of our financial inclusion work in Africa and Asia Pacific. And the one thing I will say is, to me, it seems like trust was more local, like someone said. And so when we had solutions, for example, with smallholder farmers, or so people could pay education very little bits at a time, we would always go down to the most local unit. Some people call it the last mile. We called it the first mile. And their trust still does seem strong. And people do rely on, I think, that local ecosystem. And one thing that's helped with that is what was raised before, transparency. And so when you can see how you're being paid quickly, and you receive it digitally, and there's not a percentage taken off because it's eaten up, or you get a fair market price, that helps with trust. So I think the combination of educating kind of the people who are in proximity, our grantees, with the beneficiaries, and empowering them with technology that do make people's lives better through transparency, through quicker, safer ways to get paid, even information on fair prices. I think those 2 combinations is what I've seen to be really powerful.
Helena or Angela, do you guys want to address that question?
The one thing that just struck me as you were talking was we can never forget human connection and the power of human connection. And when you have someone that comes to you that speaks your language, that looks like you,
True.
that conveys a message and says this product is okay, this service is okay, that's, I think, the linchpin. And a lot of times we talk about corporate products and services, but we forget that, again, getting back to that hyperlocal focus, that you need that human connection and having people on the ground, in community, in neighborhoods, next door neighbors, facilitating, that's the magic.
Yeah.
Hold on one second. Let's just get the mic.
Thank you. This has been fascinating. My name's Ashley Streeter-Jones. I'm a global shaper from the Melbourne Hub, and I work to get more young women and gender diverse people in politics and policy. We often hear this, in my understanding, a myth that young people aren't engaged in politics. But what I have noticed is that we're very engaged with issues, but we don't trust political institutions. Mm-hmm. In Australia, we also have 70% of our media is Murdoch media, so we don't have a lot of different sources of media necessarily. And one of our biggest issues last election was our Conservative Party not wanting to bring in an anti-corruption body in politics. So this became a big campaign issue and quite a surprising one in a few ways. How do we build trust and transparency back into institutions which may not inherently see trust and transparency as being in their interest?
Good question.
So one thing I want to speak to that, and that is that I said this earlier today, and it's got into a back and forth, but I think there are some systems that need to be completely disrupted. And then secondly, we need to acknowledge that systems that are currently in place were built by people who had different values that wanted to keep power and exclude a certain set of individuals. So with that basic understanding, then what do you do? And so when it comes especially to politics, we understand the power dynamic there, but what I find so great about your institutions and young people, that even if it's issue-based, deciding that I'm going to get into the system and then start, not being co-opted by the system, but really asking the questions and doing things different. And that gets back to this whole notion of diversity and inclusion and equity. And that is, until you create a table, don't invite me to your table, I want a brand new table. And until we get into that new table where all voices are valued, where we can respect the lived experience, we can respect the diversity of experience, knowledge, voices, and giving them the weight, that's where we are going to really see the change. And I am through knocking on the door asking for permission. So when Richard said about CEOs need to give voice, or NGOs losing trust, or at what point do we speak up, I have nothing to lose. We are at a moment in time that I call a new era, that nonprofits, especially civil society, has to speak up and be the voice. And we have to be the activists in a very good and positive way, and in partnership.
Helena?
Yeah, I think that nothing to lose is a great way to start every morning, because it allows you a lot of freedom. I wanted to talk to this point about how to include younger people, and also this point about NGOs and perception of competence and the space we're in. With government funding focused on many other things, in many cases for us, typically many of our members have statutory connections into government, but that funding to support them just gets cut off. And yet the extent to which you are helping people, the number of people you have to help with the same number of staff, that expands. Plus, you need new skill sets. You need to pay people to come on board and work with you with skill sets that companies find difficult to find around the world right now. So yes, it's really a complex space to be in, and you take punches every day. The bit I think is fun is imagine what we can build with trust and transparency, right? So take energy efficiency. Take how do you help people reduce costs and build their access to renewable energy? Well, that means looking at the assistance that you give people with the upfront cost. That means bringing people together in some sort of varieties of different communities. That means thinking about the technology that links them to. That only works with transparency through technology. It only works by bringing people together. It's not that trust and transparency is something that we should do, but it's actually the root of the next type of marketplace. And you can see that in every different sector that consumers care about, that people care about. That's really cool.
But can I just add on this? You go first.
Well, I was going to just jump on this example. So we talk about clean energy. We come to conferences like this. So then which communities get access to clean energy? I guarantee you the low-income Black and brown communities do not. But then the education piece is when you go to, and I'll just say this, a Black woman in the US and tell us we can't use a gas stove anymore because of the emissions and we need to switch to electric. Well, our comment is our food's not going to taste the same. And then, well, if laws change and say we're going to be mandated leaving gas stoves behind and moving to electricity, then how can I afford to buy a brand new electric stove? So where's the credit facility that allows me to be able to do this? So you see, from an advocacy, from a laws, public policy, all of this, there's a through line in terms of when you get to the individual, and it takes all of us to be a part of that.
Can I just piggyback on that? I know you're waiting.
No, you go first.
Just double down on the partnerships. I think just the framework we're using, and I think rightfully so, is private sector, social sector, government. But unless we all work together, which I think is what you're pointing out, this won't work. And so we can talk about trust theoretically, but when it comes to the actual implementation, we need to work together. So even if there's more trust in the private sector, like you're saying, sitting in the private sector, we couldn't do our work without NGOs, without the government. So if you think about moving to solutions kind of oriented, I think figuring out how we can piggyback on the trust we each might have in the pieces we own to bring the best assets to the problem, I think that's where it gets fun. I think that's where it gets interesting.
Finally. No, just kidding.
Please.
Not that important.
Bring it home,
It's not
Richard.
that important. I just think civil society has to establish specific goals that it has to meet. Okay, reading levels or whatever. So if companies are being held to net zero by 2040 or whatever it is, well, why doesn't civil society do the same? I mean, now maybe I'm a little ignorant about exactly what United Way promises. You promise effectiveness. But if you promise that school kids in Chicago are actually going to read at appropriate grade level by date X in 10 years, that's our big idea. And then you every year measure by it. People want measurement. They want competence based on, I'm getting there.
But Richard, how do we get there when the premise for how people view the civil society is, we want you to help fix problems, but we don't want to pay you to fix the problems. You, NGOs, are offering products and services that we value, but we don't want to pay you for it. And heaven forbid that you actually make a margin. That's the problem.
But you have to reintroduce your business model. You have to say, we need a new business model. We have a big problem. You want us to have kids read at this level? This is what it's going to take. And I expect government to give this. I expect business to do this. Go for it. You can do it.
I want to make sure.
I'll just say, watch us. We're taking that challenge on.
Good.
Do we have another audience question, please?
My question's a bit slightly offline. I follow the media a lot, including the New York Times, and I'm very well informed. I got to the stage where I actually don't know what to believe in the media any longer, because there's so many comment pieces, because so many of the so-called news items are spiced up by leaving out key bits of information in order to get an angle. So I can sort of understand why we've got to a point where people, frankly, don't really know. I mean, I'm well informed, I'm a social scientist, I know what the hell's going on, and yet even I'm struggling because I can't go and read every damn report. I'm relying on the media to tell me, here's a synopsis, and this is the pros, and these are the cons. You're just not getting it. So I don't know what we should be doing differently in order to ensure that we're better informed, and so can trust a key informant like the media.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, you're asking a very, very valid question. I mean, I think there are a few things that are happening, the first of which, as most of you know, is the deterioration of local media and the lack of that local infrastructure in order to provide people with information, which of course is primarily because of economic headwinds. I think that there are true questions around how the technology platforms disseminate information, particularly misinformation, and they see, and I'm somewhat sympathetic to them, significant challenges when it comes to content moderation and how to combat the disinformation that's online. And then I think, you need to have institutions like the New York Times where when we get something wrong, we say that we've gotten it wrong, and we hold ourselves accountable, and we follow up on news stories, and we try our hardest every day to guarantee that the facts that we're reporting are accurate. Of course, along with that, we also believe that, in opinion, for instance, We publish pieces that we agree with and that we disagree with every single day. And we do that because we believe that's in service to our readers, to human growth, to a thriving democracy. And we try to do that on the global scale. Unfortunately, just in the course of my career, we've seen fewer and fewer institutions that have the resources to do the reporting around the world that the Times is able to. And that, I think, is contributing a little bit to the trends that you're describing. Maybe one more question and then we'll wrap up. You've had your hand up a few times.
Very fast.
Yes.
Can we just remove the trust component of everything? Because trust would always be challenged. And I think that's what I was just the other day. Yesterday I was attending this blockchain. And that's what they were trying to do, is remove the trust and basically have a system wherein people don't need to, have whether can I trust this person? Can I trust this company? But you have a system that would automatically take the trust component out of it. Is that possible? I mean,
that's such a challenging question. Maybe we can each answer it, and along with that, talk a little bit about how we can work together and collaborate more to wrap the session up. Richard, do you want to kick us off?
So I think the first thing that, because I mostly work with business, that business needs to do is deprive platforms that spread disinformation of oxygen. Stop advertising. Pull your promotion money. Make sure that they understand that they have a consequential impact on society. And the boycott of Twitter for several months has had a modest impact, but I think the Facebook one failed. But the necessity of getting it right in the platforms that are probably primary source information for a third to 40% of people is urgent.
But do we need trust at all? Does it need to be part of the equation?
I think it's the central proposition, not just of my trust barometer, but just general thought. No, because if you don't have trust, you don't have any efficiency. You're constantly running while looking behind you. And you also are fundamentally eliminating the possibility of innovation, and you're somehow protecting status quo.
And I would just say trust is important, starting with building the human relationship, which then leads to communication, and then leads to collaboration, and then leads to creating community solutions.
Helena?
I tried a collaborative approach to answering your question about how we collaborate. So asking my board, and my president is in Malaysia and constantly channels Mandela, actually, and said, remember, act from hope, not fear. I think that's a core principle. My board member from Zimbabwe, no one left behind. And I think those are two really important things to remember as you head into this. Trust doesn't get replaced by technology. It just doesn't.
Yeah, I would start by piggybacking off that. Even if you have systems, principles, even privacy by design, even if you think about business processes, even if they're so shored up that it's not a subjective thing that you have to think about trusting, I think you still need to give voice to why it should be trusted and make people comfortable. I think along with transparency is translation, and having people understand in their own words why they should be doing something or why they should trust, even if the system is sound. So I don't think you're going to get rid of this notion of trust. And I think collaboration, I think I've been saying it the whole time, is absolutely necessary. And I think one of the ways that I think that's helped that we can do that is really understand a lot of times these sectors have the same goal. So the person that the government is trying to get benefits to, the beneficiary that the social sector is trying to serve are often the clients or the customers of private sector. So I think if we can start looking at the end goal and the commonalities, even if we get there different ways, I think that'll help with collaboration.
Yeah, I have to agree that I think trust is a core principle of all the work of everyone who's on the stage. And without it, it would be very, very hard to achieve our goals on a daily basis. And I want to end on the idea of acting from hope and not fear. So thank you for introducing that. thank you all for being here today. Thank you all for coming again, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.